Good morning, Shamila, Harry.
Hi.
Due to the coronavirus, as we know, and thank you so much for being here today. We have helped with the student body at the LSE to successfully transform the annual gathering of the China Development Forum now into the virtual space. And so first of all, why don't we just save some time, and Shamila and Harry, if you could each just introduce yourself briefly.
So it's Shamila Whelan. I'm the Deputy Chief Economist for Althea Capital. Before that, I was with CLSA, Merrill Lynch, BP. I've covered Asia as an economist for 20 years, China and Asia's a specialization. And I'll leave it at that. Harry?
Sure, thank you.
Economist.
Yes, so I'm Harry Broadman. I'm the chair of the Emerging Markets practice at Berkeley Research Group, which is a litigation expert witness consulting firm, and I'm also on the faculty at Johns Hopkins in Washington. I've been working in China since the late 1980s on state-owned enterprise reform, trade policy, corporate governance, the like.
And I should add, actually, you are one of the leading trade experts. I think that's so much needed in today's world, which is very interesting to combine your expertise together today. So, Harry, I'm going to start with you because you're closer to me. So, you just talked about you have been involved in China's reform and opening up process pretty much over the past 30 years or so. So, over this long span of economic development, I would say if one person today, let's say, just comes from Mars and look at planet Earth and say, well, how is everybody doing? And they would say probably, well, China is going pretty well. And I would say there is actually a relative rise of China and the relative decline of the West. So in terms of a long span, lifetime experience and the economic growth trajectory that you see, where exactly in this economic development curve that China falls today? Are we still going upwards or starting to go downwards? Where do we lie?
So I think it's appropriate that you take that long perspective that you mentioned, and if you go back to the beginning of China opening up in the late 70s, and then Deng Xiaoping's reform program with state-owned enterprise reform in the 1990s, it's hard to argue that China has not transitioned remarkably with a series of very innovative reforms, particularly with a country that large, both in terms of population and in terms of geography. And some amazing growth and poverty alleviation. I think if someone came from Mars and they saw China, they think, wow, this is, if they knew the history, they would be quite amazed and impressed with what the Chinese have done. I think the question now is, where are we, or where is China in terms of this long tail of reform and growth? As we know, not every economy is going to continue to grow, and there's obviously going to be cyclical changes. In my mind, the question for the person from Mars or those of us here on Earth is whether or not the secular growth of China is beginning to slow down. And my own view is yes, and that it has little to do with the trade war, which I'm sure we will talk about, but that it's due to some internal contradictions in the socialist market economy, which is actually a contradiction, oxymoron in and of itself, that are the Chinese policymakers running out of room in terms of trying, in my words and others, trying to have their cake and eat it too, by having both socialism and capitalism at the same time. And my view is that China has some very difficult decisions to make from an economic policy perspective, with the need for the party to continue to control the state-owned enterprises, which are still the very largest employers in the country. There's a big price to pay in terms of economic growth in the long run for having that kind of model. And so I think the 1.4 billion R&B question is whether or not there will be sufficient reform in the state-owned enterprises finally to enter into a more commercial type of market and real separation from government and commercial decision making on the part of the enterprises. So that's, to me, that's sort of where we are, today, thinking about the Chinese economic prospects.
Sharmila, a lot to unpack. Socialism and capitalism, it's not a binary choice. I would say arguably China has had this amazing way of combining socialist and the capitalist characteristics over the past 4 decades. Is that sustainable? And China has this centennial plan, basically by 2021 to achieve essentially the economic income level of a Central European country status, and by 2049, which is the 100-year celebration of the founding of the PRC, to essentially become, in Chinese leadership's words, one of the greatest nations on earth. How do you interpret that? And in between now, for the next 30 years, what's going to happen?
Well, it's a very good question, Shirley. I mean, socialism, a socialistic state and a political system that is dominated by the Communist Party or one party, and a capitalist, trying to become a capitalist economy. Can they combine? I would say yes. Remember, in the Asian miracle and the Asian tigers, they worked together all the way till the 1997 Asian crisis, right? The Koreas, the Taiwans, the Thailands, they were all either one-party systems or governments or benevolent dictatorships, like the Suharto government in Indonesia. And then it all fell apart with the 1997 crisis, and then they moved to multi-party democracies. So China could go down that route? I don't think so. I think, or it could go, the other option is what happened in Russia, the whole falling apart there, right? But I don't see China going down that route because the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese leadership have been extremely adaptive through time, moving from a traditional communist model to more market. And I see them going more down the Singaporean line, right, where you've got a paternalistic state, and a lot of the big corporations are quasi-government corporations, but they function like any corporation competing in the global market. So I don't see the Communist Party going anytime soon, or the model changing. What Xi has done has consolidated power, right? And the China dream, which was, when he was going around going the American dream, everybody kind of assumed that the China dream is the American dream. The China dream is very different from the American dream. The China dream is the state is very much in control and is at the epicenter, and the capitalist model builds around that. And so far they've been quite successful, and I don't see that changing.
Okay, so you don't see any changes basically from the current political economic architecture all the way through to 2050-ish?
I'd be surprised. I mean, never say never. 2050 is a very long time when you're sitting in 2020. I think it'll adapt.
Harry, you just talked about there is some inherent complexity here that from both of your opinions. So you talked about you want to see that it's essential for China's economic success that China successfully reforms its state sector. So last year at the fourth plenum of the party's Congress, and so basically and subsequently from both President Xi and Vice Premier Liu He, they both said that state-owned economy or sector are going to take a dominant role in China's economy, and Vice Premier Liu He said the state sector is only going to become bigger, better, and stronger. That goes quite against the idea that you had in terms of propelling more private sector, more market economy. And also from what Sharmila said, state sector is going to remain as the fundamental core of China's economic architecture. Do you agree with that?
So let me hold on to your views. So let me be clear. My view is exactly what was expressed on the plenum. That the state will continue to dominate the economy. But let's be clear, let's contrast between the Singaporean model, which is the government and the state, in the case of China, it's the government and state, but you have the Communist Party, okay, and it's a very different ownership structure. And I've read many plenums over these many years in China, and frankly, I was struck by the words that I read that I could have picked the same plenum up from the 1980s, and the same words would have been written then. And so my view is that they are still not grappling with successfully the inherent contradiction between wanting to have the Communist Party run the economy and having a commercial sector. That at some point in time, something's got to give. And I can use the expression they want to have the cake and eat it too, or they've painted themselves into a corner. But I think, as long as the Communist Party is sitting in the boards of all these state-owned enterprises and ultimately are the ultimate owner, this is very different from the Singaporean model or a European model or pick your country. Even the Vietnamese have been frankly more innovative in the sense of recognizing that these inherent contradictions of socialism on the one hand and market-driven on the other hand will have very great difficulty coexisting. And I think one of the reasons why China has been able to grow as fast as it has been growing over these years is because frankly it's a large economy. And so you can continue to ride that bicycle, fall off occasionally and get back on because you've got a lot of degrees of freedom when you have a very large economy. If it was a very small economy and you made a mistake, you really be done for. But I think this goes to my very first point, which I think, and I am very admiring of the reformers in China in recognizing and trying to be innovative over time to experiment, to realize they've made a mistake and try to correct things. But those corrections, frankly, have all been on the margin. And as I said, if you pick up a plenum statement from 25 years ago, you would see the exact same words. So I think that's, to me, that's the issue, that they've run out of running space, a runway, if you will, and there aren't many more mistakes that they can make without sort of upheavals in the labor market and the like.
Shamila, you earlier mentioned that China has successfully gone from a communist model to a market-driven model. And going into the future, as we just talked about, perhaps China is moving backwards now, you think? By re-embracing more of a state-led sort of economic model to give the state sector a bigger presence in the economy. So we left the communist model, we went to the market-based model over the past 40 years. Is China continuing on that path or is China going backwards? What do you think, both of you?
See, I think, I agree with Harry. I think we all agree that the Communist Party isn't going anywhere. And the China dream is the state controls and power has been political power has been consolidated by Xi, right? I think we agree with that. I think where I differ is within that what is changing is the state-owned enterprises are going to be running more and more on a commercial basis, right?
So are we going backwards?
No, we're not. We're going forward. It is evolving because the leadership realizes that you don't want huge behemoth state enterprises with loads of NPLs, loads of excess capacity because it's being directed rather than responding to market supply and demand conditions. And the huge debt overhang has shown them that, right? And that's why they're restructuring. So going forward, and to be competitive in the global market, they've got to be operating on a commercial basis. And you take Huawei, right? But it's dominating.
We don't think Huawei is a state company, by the way.
Well, we don't, but it's dominating 5G, right? The UK decision to go with Huawei was very simple. That if we didn't, the rollout of 5G would be delayed here in this country for 4 years, and it would cost taxpayers a lot more money, right? Which is the reason, the cost and the technology is why a lot of Europe is going in, Australia and Canada considering as well. So to me, that is a company that is competing on the global stage, and it's still, doesn't have a state presence. And I see more that kind of companies emerging because the leadership is very focused on profits and the bottom line and being competitive, right? Because it's a part of their larger agenda of where is China going to be in this race for economic supremacy between China and the US, right?
So you're pointing to a very interesting term. I think that'll get Harry's nerves going. So it's China-US economic supremacy. Isn't that exactly, essentially, what China and the US are competing against is economic supremacy? And so trade war is part of part of the programs within this overarching economic objective. And so, is it really about fair trade? Harry, is it really about national security when it comes to Huawei? Or is it just simply because the US is the predominant economic power in the world and China is challenging that position?
There's a lot to unpack there. I think the notion that Huawei is a privately owned enterprise and has little to do with the government in China is fanciful. I think, again, I think Huawei is doing what it should be doing in terms of trying to proliferate what it is that it makes and sells. I think the rub is, frankly, that the United States has fallen behind in terms of using the private sector and the government as separate entities to enhance the R&D within the United States to make the United States more competitive. And this brings me back to the days when I worked on Capitol Hill back in the 80s, just before I started working in China, of the Japanese threat coming to the U.S. And frankly, it's a very similar story now with Huawei in the sense of, so we have, the United States has a very different model about R&D being financed mostly by the thought of the government is that the R&D would be financed mostly by the private sector, and only when the market fails and there's a public good will the government begin to fund basic research and development. And I think what has happened over the years, in part because of different political philosophies in the White House, the tendency of, frankly, the US government, including both the executive branch and the Congress, to not think in terms of the long run, is very much the kind of debate that we had with the Japanese, which is the US has become less and less internationally competitive, right? And I think the beauty of the China model, put aside the communist issue, and the beauty of the Singaporean model is that, when you have a state activist in the economy and recognizes that there is a goal to become internationally competitive vis-a-vis other nation states, the question is, where do you strike a balance between the government and the marketplace in terms of innovation? And I think so what's happened now is in the US we've had very much obviously a very private sector led research and development enterprise with the universities. And we've left it largely to private firms to begin to try to move from 4G to 5G. But other countries, notably China, have been focusing on the long game, which China is extraordinarily well capable of thinking about. And I think that's sort of where we are now. And the question is, if Huawei were really a private sector company, and it had nothing to do with the state of China or the Communist Party of China, and that let's say, for the sake of argument, Huawei was a Qualcomm, right, but based in China, and it behaved as a private sector, I think there would be a very different conversation going on right now between the US on the one hand and the EU and the UK on the other about how to deal with Huawei. But I think that's the issue, and it's because it's the worry in Washington is because Huawei is so closely connected with the Communist Party and the state. To what extent will the equipment that they're using and the chips that they're deploying in other countries be used for other purposes other than strictly commercial purposes? And it's a fair debate. It's a fair debate, but I think it is important to recognize that the U.S. has fallen behind because it's not made very smart decisions and it's not thought in terms of the long run, right?
Huawei, as you said, it's a fair debate. It's a compelling debate. But it's only one piece of the bigger debate.
Correct.
So I want to come back to my original question.
Sure.
So is the US-China strategic rivalry today about economic supremacy?
Yeah, no, I think well, it's certainly about economic supremacy. It's also about military supremacy and other domains. I'm not terribly qualified to speak about the military issues, but in terms of economic supremacy, I think that's clearly one of the pillars of the debate, and the question is, who's going to win this race in the long run, and it reminds me. Sorry to keep looking backwards, but when I was working in Russia, there was always this debate. Well, who's going to win the race between China and Russia? What kind of reform model is going to prosper the most? Do you do political liberalization first, and then economic liberalization, which is the Russia model, so to speak, at least then, under Yeltsin, or do you stick with economic reform but still keep a tight reins on the political side, which is the China model? So I think the U.S. is neither of those two extremes in some sense. But yeah, no, ultimately I think that's at the heart of the matter. And from a U.S. perspective, as I say, the government has been extraordinarily short-sighted in terms of R&D investment for the long run, infrastructure within the United States, something that I've been talking about for 25 years. It is the Achilles heel of the United States economy. It's, in China, they've done a fantastic job looking at investing in the infrastructure, right? And that has helped a very long and large economy continue to grow because you've had the infrastructure there. But in the United States, we don't have that luxury. And so without infrastructure, any of a large economic space, it's threatening how unified that market is and economically integrated is the U.S. market.
Sure, because infrastructure builds connectivity,
Absolutely.
Which is what China is doing. Sharmila, you worked in Asia with Asian economy for quite a long time. So Harry just agreed that it is fundamentally U.S.-China is about economic supremacy. So I'm going to put to you a hypothetical. This is a complete hypothetical. Let's say if today is not U.S.-China, it is U.S.-Japan, as it was back in the 1980s. Japan is a democracy. Part of the West doesn't really have an ideological conflict with the United States. In the 1980s, it was the world's largest creditor nation. It was the second largest economy in the world, and certainly it was the world's largest trading nation. What did the U.S. do? The U.S. maintained a Plaza Accord, and everything happened afterwards. The U.S. maintained its economic supremacy against the up and rising power, right? Even within the Western alliance. And so today, let's say if China were to be like Japan, this is a complete hypothetical again, but that was still, would the U.S. be happy that China were to become the largest economy in the world?
I don't think so, right? It's any superpower, right? Was Britain happy when the US took over? Okay, it happened while they were sleeping because they weren't, watching. Every 100 years, new superpowers arise, right? And challenges the existing superpower. Is existing superpower happy to relinquish the economic power with which the even bigger power that goes, which is the geopolitical power? No. So, and remember, there was a lot of friction between Japan and the US at that time. And I know you say that, okay, Japan is a democracy, but let's be saying the LDP was a one-party system for decades, right? And so it wasn't so much the political system, the clash, but that didn't make the rivalry any less, right? I think what is different is the sheer size of China. Right, and the technological war, right? AI, robotics, all the machine learning. It is dependent on data, right? Machine learning is data, right? And it's about how much data you did. China, by the sheer size, 1.3 billion people, how much it's connected, right? 90% of people, 95% have got smartphones, and the applications have taken off. Like, you know about WeChat and how data it's generating, because it's tracking all kind of consumption, spending patterns, right? And winning the AI war and the machine learning war is about data, capacity, and in China, and that's what the real challenge for the US and for Europe, because also the privacy laws and the intellect on China on global data, on data generation are weak. People don't mind, right?
Going back to 2050 question, do you think China will become the largest economy in the world by or before 2050?
When you say largest economy in what
Largest
sense?
economy in terms of GDP output.
I would say yes.
Would you say yes, Harry?
Oh yeah, I think it's a
You say no.
no. It's a mathematical mathematical reality.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, it's hard, when you're 1.35, 1.4 billion people.
It's just maths, right?
Yeah.
The 9% per annum growth rates are behind China.
Yes.
Right? The trade war has had an impact. There's no doubt about this. You've seen growth momentum slow loss led throughout. The trade surplus has shrunk. Right? Going forward, China, it's an aging society, number one. Number two is, it's moving from a export manufacturing-led model to a services domestic demand-led model. That means the long-term trend growth rate is probably going down towards 6%, which Chinese leadership is happy with. But you do the maths with 1.3 billion, if you're looking at pure GDP as a measure,
So I think
to see it.
Yeah, I think it's true that China will, even if it grows at 3%, which I think we probably have a different perspective. I think it's going. I think the 6% figure, frankly, is, and I've worked with these numbers for a long time. I'm not sure I put a lot of credibility in the number. But even let's say it slows down to 3%. 3% of that size of an economy is going to overtake the United States. I think the issue for me, and I think for investors and my clients, is to think about what's going on internally in the fabric of China's economy. And so if you take AI, which I think is a very important issue, generally, it depends on your view about whether artificial intelligence and robotics is going to displace labor as an input. And if you believe that that is the case generally, and you enter into a territory of greater labor-saving technologies as opposed to, labor-using technologies, that has severe repercussions for countries that have very large populations. And so I think there's an adaptation question in China, or any country in the United States. I mean, this is a debate we're all going to be facing around the world. I think the question today that's very important is, I think, double clicking on your question about the rivalry, if you will, between the U.S. and China, is to what extent is the trade war, how is that manifesting and coloring those relationships? And I think my own view is I think there are very serious problems with China's conduct with respect to its trade policy, insofar as Beijing signed up in 2001 to join the WTO. And this was during an era when I was working on these issues. My view is that China can have whatever kind of economy it wants. I believe that wholeheartedly. But it cannot sign up for the WTO. And I've gone through the succession agreement very carefully, the 2001, and they're in broad violation of the succession commitments. So again, it's another instance of the Chinese wanting to have their cake and eat it too. And so my view is that the trade war that the US has been engaging with China is extraordinarily wrong-headed. It's using the wrong weapon, tariffs, and it's the US in the foxhole by itself, bilaterally. The real issue is if the rest of the world, or the rest of the WTO, wants China to adhere and behave as as part of multilateral rules, having Trump go at it bilaterally and using tariffs, you're not going to get anywhere. And so I think it's incredibly misdirected. It's inflicting, frankly, a lot of pain on the United States economy, as we know. It's inflicting, to some extent, pain on the Chinese economy. But to me, the most ironic characteristic of the trade war as we sit here today is that the US is becoming more like China in dealing with this problem than the other way around. So if you look at the Phase 1 agreement, a core of this agreement are large state-to-state deals in agricultural products, okay? Now, if you're a free marketeer in the United States and you look at this, you go, well, wait a second, why is the US government now directly transacting with the Chinese government? What happened to our free enterprise system? I don't have a theological view about it. I'm just saying that there's an inherent contradiction now on the United States side. And I think a lot of people are beginning to scratch their head, okay, so what exactly is the US strategy vis-a-vis China? And why aren't we gathering up other large multilateral trading partners and saying, listen, China, you have your choice. You want to stay in the WTO? You got to fulfill these obligations. If you want to renegotiate your accession agreement, we can do that. But be aware that once we enter that period, your tariffs are going to go up. You're not going to get the preferential treatment that you have now. Or the third choice is, if you want to leave the WTO, that's fine too. Because it's a free world and you can have whatever you want, but you're not going to get benefits that you're not agreeing to the other side of the ledger for. So I think that is the fundamental question where we are today, and I think the US has made a tragic mistake in not thinking about the battle with China on trade in that way.
Talking about the trade deal, I think by and large, most of the political economic analysts around the world, I think sort of come to the understanding that the trade deal phase 1 is basically a non-effect, right? It's a commercial deal. It doesn't really achieve the ultimate agenda either the U.S. Wants to achieve, or essentially, it doesn't really give China the benefit of, really to optimize its economic model. And so the question now is that it's already signed. And now we're coming to 2020. For the next 2 years, China is going to buy $200 billion on a firm commitment of additional U.S. goods and particularly agricultural products. Now, when China is hit with coronavirus, and as the crisis continues to spread, is China going to fulfill the commitment? And can China fulfill the commitment at this point? Does China have any leeway to say, well, perhaps it's not a good time for us, perhaps we can delay the phase 1 commitments?
I think they are going to fulfill. The fact that last week they rolled back the import tariffs on US goods as they had promised, because you'd think that if we got the coronavirus, economic activity is going to be hit, we need to stimulate domestically. We don't need to roll back tariffs and get more imports in, right? That's taking away demand, right? So I think they'll fulfill it, because 200 billion on agricultural goods is neither here nor there. China's bigger worry, there's a trade war, right? And China knows it's not going to win it, right? Just because of the difference in the deficits, right? So China knows that there's a limit on how much tariffs they can slap on in retaliation. So they know they're not going to win the trade war, and that is not the big war for them. The much bigger concern for them is if the US disrupts the global flow of technology to China, because that puts at risk President Xi's Made in China 2025 plan, which is, as you know, about upgrading the whole manufacturing sector and moving into high-tech and advanced manufacturing and services, right?
We're talking about
and that has an implication for the longer-term economic future and of China, its dependence on foreign technology, etc. So that's the much bigger picture, which I believe the Chinese see. The trade is neither here nor there for them, right?
So the trade is already sort of like what you said, Harry, yesterday, sort of the arcane 20th century economic growth model for China, as China continues to operate, it probably plays a smaller part. But you're saying the U.S. is blacklisting of Chinese tech companies and essentially stopping the chips from being sold to China. That's the choking point for China's economy.
That's a big problem. That's a big issue for China, right? But going back to the trade thing, right? The U.S. might continue to put on tariffs. Well, at the moment, tensions are escalating, but it might. I think it's going to come in ebbs and flows, right? But trade flows will happen regardless of what governments decide or multilateral organizations say. This is the reality, right? So if you look already, for years, global trade and capital flows have been reorientating towards China. So to put it in, give you some numbers to put it in perspective. Okay, China is moving, as we know, from a investment, export, manufacturing model to a domestic and service-driven growth model. But despite this, if you look at trade openness, right? Trade openness in China is 68%. The US is 19%. The US is one of the most close economies on that, against the world average of 42%. If you look at share of global imports, right, China's already punching above its weight. It's about 65% of US GDP, but its share of global imports is 11%, which is not too far behind the US, which is at 14%. But more importantly is the trend. If you look at the trend over the last 4 years, China is going up like this, and US is going down like this. And the point being, China is becoming the destination of choice, right, for global exporters, companies, and foreign direct investors, because it's got a large and growing middle class, which is getting increasingly prosperous. So the trade war, yes, it is hurting on a cyclical basis, right? But the secular trend is, which goes back to the whole thing of China's economic weight, right, and its rising share in global GDP. You can't stop that.
So I think one of the issues which we haven't talked about, but it's sort of an add-on to this point, which is outbound investment on the part of China into advanced countries like the U.S. and like European markets. And the question, going back to the national security question, in the case of the United States, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, CFIUS, which when I was younger I sat on when I was in the White House, but many of these countries now are putting in place constraints on inbound FDI from places like China. And at least under this White House, the strictness of CFIUS decisions under a new law, which passed and was enacted last year, is becoming tougher and tougher. And in my most recent trip to China, meeting with investors and law firms and corporate clients, the Chinese believe that the U.S. is closed right now because of CFIUS and because of this new law. And I think you're seeing around the world, other OECD countries, greater and greater stringency on allowing foreign direct investment from countries that might be threatening the national security as defined by the laws of those particular countries. And I think trade is one thing, but clearly outbound investment is another. And I think this is where we're now getting to a tipping point in terms of at least the U.S. vis-a-vis China, and also in European countries and Australia, about what are going to be the controls put on within those economies in terms of blocking investment that those decision makers believe is threatening the international competitiveness and national security of these economies. And that's what Huawei is about. I mean, at the heart of it, that's what it is, right?
So we talked about a multitude of U.S.-China conflicts, and of course that dominates many of the global economic trajectories for our time. So we talked about from trade as the base level, and then we go into investment area, and then subsequently essentially it's tech. On that investment question, There has been a lot of speculation. Of course, U.S. Congressman has proposed laws to essentially disallow, potentially to disallow Chinese companies to be listed in the U.S. And there are 186 Chinese companies that are currently listed on the U.S. main boards, and I think about something like 800 or so on the pink sheets. And so the companies that are on the main boards as of today, we're talking about well over 1.2 trillion US dollars. And so these companies, in a few years' time, some of them are talking about, well, there is a real risk that we might be forced to be delisted. Is there, what's the genuine feasibility of this comprehensive capital market decoupling between China and the US?
Well, you've been seeing delisting of Chinese companies off the US stock exchanges over the last few years, but that's more to do with governance and regulatory issues and compliance issues, right?
Is there going to be a full decoupling systematically, basically by law?
So I think
you're better positioned. I'd be hard pushed to see that, frankly.
Yeah.
And that would be like shooting yourself in the foot.
No, I think the way to think about it is, will there be forced decoupling, as opposed to sort of a natural or organic decoupling? So I think what you're referring to is Mnuchin and Treasury talking about we're gonna ban Chinese companies from being listed on the stock exchanges of the United States. And what's interesting is I don't think that's sustainable for two reasons. One, I think the world is integrated, which we all know, but more importantly, what that is doing is you're also hitting in the kneecaps US investors who want to invest in those companies. And do they have, will this regulation, if it should come to pass, and I'm not sure that it will, I think, as we said, this is shooting the US investors in the foot. If there is a reason why, regardless of the nationality of a company listed on the exchange, that their governance mechanisms, other regulatory compliance matters are out of whack with the systems that are required to be listed, that's one thing. But to do it on a wholesale basis, simply on the basis of nationality, is a whole other issue. And at least the proposed regs that I've read don't discriminate between those two principles, right? And so I think that, and that's part of this larger picture of whether or not there will be forced decoupling. And I think it's very difficult to do, and I think it's not even sustainable. Let me just give you, in my view, sort of a story about this. One of the fears about a forced decoupling is, oh my God, there's only going to be one technology standard in 20 years from now, and it's going to be a Chinese technical standard, right, for the sake of argument, because they're going to dominate us. And my view is that there is always a natural race between technological standards. So if you think about the race, if you will, between VHS and DVD and Betamax, right now it's DVDs, and whether and it's all a question of the game of who's king of the hill, and there's a competition among these standards, and there are such economies of scale and scope that ultimately will drive the market to select a particular technology. So you can, if China says no, from now on we're only going to be using this technology. Well, there are going to be other people who are going to invent different technologies, and it all is going to depend on consumer preference. And as I say, when you look at what has happened over video over the last 20 years, you could not have forced a different outcome. Now, obviously, if in the end China becomes literally the world's factory, and let's use again the example of video, that they are the only producer of video machines, and they said this will be the standard. Well, that's sort of a take or pay issue, or take it or leave it issue. I just don't think that's going to happen. So I think it's a constant competition among nation states about who's going to integrate with whom, and so I think the notion that a forced decoupling is a strategy that is sustainable or winnable, I think is far-fetched.
And just to add the point, going back to one of the points you made earlier about forced decoupling and shooting the US yourself in the foot if you're in the US. There's other risk is that US investors will want to invest in the rest of the world, whether it's China or elsewhere, right? So the money could come out of the US anyway, and it's invested into China through Hong Kong, right? Which is, as we know, the main channel for foreign investors to enter the China market, right? So you've got capital outflows because the money's coming out and investing through other countries into China or wherever. At the same time, you've got Chinese holding less and less US treasuries as their assets, the matching assets in their foreign exchange reserves holding, because you've seen the massive decline in US dollar, the proportion of China's foreign exchange reserves that are held in US dollars. So, and the matching asset is obviously the US treasuries, right? I don't need to spell it out. You see the problem for the US, right? You got at a time when they need buyers for US treasuries and probably in the domestic market, they've got money flying out of the US from their own residents because they're chasing returns, right? Money is going to go where the returns are better. They're not going to go where because the Chinese government has said like you got to come here, or the US said you can't do this. Investors are chasing yield.
So
that's a bottom
saying,
line, right? Just as private companies, and the reason why trade and capital flows are changing regardless of what's happening with trade wars and tariff, companies are driven by a profit motive. They're going to go to the market where they can make a profit. Market where there's a profit is where there is the demand and there is the purchasing power. That's the free market,
clear,
right?
Yes. So basically, Harry's saying it's not likely that even if Congress were to table this proposal, it's not going to be targeted just the Chinese companies. It's going to be against a certain category of behaviors. And even if that were to happen, Shamil, you're saying, well, capitalists are still going to, even if on a regulatory level, there were any sort of policy of decoupling the capital markets, investors from Wall Street are still going to invest anyhow, right? Which is effective. A question of how effective, any sort of regulatory policy is going to be.
And I think there's another side to it as well, right? Which is, it is in the interest of the Chinese government and the Chinese companies to improve their standards, right, of corporate governance, compliance, transparency, if they want to compete in a global market, right? And yesterday I was at a seminar and it was really interesting. 60% of listed companies on the Chinese stock exchange have got ESG policies in place, which have been scored and rated by MSCI. So it's not just that they've written a policy document just for shareholders, right? So they're changing. Again, when you look at BRI, right? China's got more than enough money to finance BRI, right? The price tag when 2013 was 900 billion, okay, it's risen probably well over $1 trillion. It's not as though China doesn't have the money to finance it, right? And if they do it through RMB, they can just print it. But what has been interesting in the last 2 years of BRI is the way they are trying to engage the World Bank, the ADB, the IMF, and they're not looking for them for money. What they're trying to bring in is the best international practices on due diligence, on risk management, partly to give it credibility, but also, remember, all their policy banks have led to BRI. If those debts go bad, that becomes a backroom for a crisis in the Chinese economy. So China changes as well, right, as you adapt, right?
So let me go back to you, Harry, on the Huawei question. So when President Trump came over to London at the NATO summit, he was trying very hard, there was, again, this very compelling narrative on the basis of national security, and so he basically was trying to, propose this transatlantic solidarity on its position against the Huawei. However, Prime Minister Boris Johnson just surprised, I think, sort of the Western world by allowing limited access of UK's 5G networks for Huawei. And so, how do you interpret the future tipping point? Is Huawei the Iron Curtain today, the digital Iron Curtain for the 21st century?
Well, I think in the short run it is, but again, going back to my analogy of the children's game of who's king of the hill, the question is, over time, it's not going to be in the short run, but over time, will there be 6G or 7G, and who will be on the top then? And I think Huawei is the immediate danger in terms of the U.S. perspective. And I think from what we read in the newspapers, I was not in the phone call between Johnson and Trump, but clearly Trump is very upset. The question is Huawei's inroads into European countries and the UK going to motivate the US to finally say, okay, sort of as I was mentioning a while ago, it's time for the US to get their R&D house in order. And I think that's clearly going on now in the United States, but Huawei clearly has a head start.
But supposedly, it's more than a U.S. question. This is really, as President Trump proposed, this is a transatlantic question. Is he able to hold this solidarity?
I think it's going to be very difficult. I mean, I think at this point, the leverage that the U.S. has vis-a-vis the UK and the EU generally, or other parts of the world that might be embracing Huawei, I think that leverage over time has eroded simply just because of the way nations compete with each other, and clearly the role of the United States, at least as a leader of sort of the free world and essentially pulling out of the WTO, not in fact, but in terms of action. It's not clear how much sway the U.S. has. Now, I think one of the leading indicators of that is what's going on right now is the discussions about a EU-US and a US-UK and a UK-EU three bilateral trade agreements. And it's something that I've been working on a fair amount in the last few weeks. And we're going to see just how much leverage the U.S. has in this three-way dance between those three countries and three bilaterals.
Coronavirus, as it continues to grapple the attention all over the world, what is the economic trajectory you give for China's economy in 2020?
Well, it all depends upon when the coronavirus peaks in terms of the number of new cases each day. Now, we've heard out of the WHO that the last 2 days the numbers have peaked and they're coming down. Now, if this is indeed true, then the impact of coronavirus will be short term. You're going to get very bad numbers out of China in the first quarter. It's as we know. Factories are closed, so, regional and global supply chains have been, no one is spending. You'll have a residual impact into the second quarter, depending on how long that lasts, depends on how fast companies and shipments are up and running. But you'll have a bounce back from it because it's delayed. Demand has not been destroyed because of the coronavirus. It's been delayed. So I would expect a bounce back, definitely coming in from sometime in the second quarter. So for me, coronavirus is a short-term one-off impact. Now, if you're asking about the underlying growth story for China this year, even before we had the coronavirus or Iran at the start of the year, where we're going to have another war here, and the global economic outlook this year is much better than last year. Last year we had a massive slowdown in global US dollar purchasing power, and you had the US trade war, China trade war, and that had massive knock-on effects onto global trade, manufacturing, and GDP growth. This
so you're saying it's going to be a negligible impact.
Yeah, negligible, and the underlying is more positive than last year.
But for Harry, again the same question. Over the Chinese New Year period, so we're talking about 142 billion US dollars of restaurant consumption, retail shopping for 2019. This year, luxury shops are closed, no one is going to restaurants, and I guess, you can say that the demand will pick up, but one can only eat a piece of steak a day, right? So how do we pick up these retail demands that were lost over, say, a quarter or two? You give what's your picture?
No, I think, the virus is bad enough. From an economic standpoint, the fact that it happened right in the Lunar New Year was really bad, because that was the one quarter, so to speak, that you would expect, a lot of growth, at least particularly at the retail and the travel services and the financial services part of China. I don't know, I'm not a scientist or a health guy, I can't tell you whether what the WHO says is correct or not. But whenever it begins to slow down, and hopefully it does starting yesterday, there will be residual effects, and it's not going to be an immediate lifting, right? There's going to be a hangover economically, and I think it's not just the economic effects within China, which we were just talking about, but you've got U.S. firms, their foreign subsidiaries in China, who sell more in China than they sell in the U.S., and in fact, those U.S. subsidiaries in China sell more in China than their parent companies export to China. And so you're going to have economic effects coming back on the earnings statements of some U.S. multinationals, and it's not U.S. alone. There are French companies and German companies and the like, and so, and I saw the other day that the IMF is now beginning to figure in, and we're coming up in the spring meetings in March, about what the economic impacts of the coronavirus outbreak is going to have, not just in China, but globally. So I think it's a big question mark, and I think that when we look at the data retrospectively, when hopefully this passes, I think we're going to see a blip downwards. And then the question is, what is the rebound? We always know that when there's a crisis, the rebound, you sort of overshoot and then you smooth back out. We just don't know, but there's clearly going to be an economic effect. And my point is that it's not just going to be in China. It's going to be global, and it's going to affect the U.S. economy. It's going to affect other economies as well.
And again, to answer your question about the rebound, it's not about eating one steak or 10 steaks. It's about the dress that you didn't buy because you couldn't get out, or you couldn't, the household goods, the consumer durable goods. That's what's going to come back.
So the trick is you need to buy a new dress and eat a steak at the same time. Is that?
Steaks for dinner. Exactly. But anyway, that'll put us, give us enough time to come back in 2021 at this very meeting. Perhaps we can look in retrospect. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much.